This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. And I'd like to thank Jacinta Thompson, the Executive Director, who can't be here tonight. Thank her, the team and the volunteers for having us here for this event that is being jointly hosted by the Hawke Centre Social Policy Group and the Centre for Digital Wellbeing. Also like to acknowledge that we're on Kaurna land and acknowledge the cultural authority of Kaurna elders and pay my respects to elders past, present and those still to come. And also to remember that this land has never been ceded and that injustice continues to this day, and recommend wholeheartedly that all of us commit to supporting the Uluru Statement from the Heart as we move towards a voice to Parliament and treaty and truth. We've become really aware recently of the impact of digital technology on the lives of young people. Here in South Australia, it's been front page news, especially around bullying and violence in schools. There was another incident in a high school yesterday. But there's far more to it than that. We're encouraging young people to increasingly use digital technology in their learning. And we know that even if there are mobile bans in place in schools, what happens in the classroom and schoolyard is carried over onto social media the moment young people get access to their devices. But we've also seen young people in the news recently admitting to being radicalised over the internet and using digital technology to spread harmful and socially divisive messages further to their networks. As a parent myself, I've witnessed the impact on my children in both positive and negative ways. New social media platforms like Be Real have taken off in something of an attempt to combat the body and wealth shaming of the more popular platforms we're familiar with. But there is a long way to go if we're going to change the digital environment our young people are operating in. We're here tonight with experts covering a range of angles on this topic: misinformation and disinformation, the value and challenges for quality education, and how the digital world impacts on our social and society's commitment to gender equality and safety for everyone. Tonight we're going to hear from our three panellists, who I'll introduce in a minute at the beginning. They're going to give short speeches on their particular areas of expertise, and then we're going to have a panel discussion about the solutions and actions we can all take to help young people engage ethically in the online environment and achieve excellent social, emotional and educational outcomes. We know that the boundaries between digital and physical worlds are now essentially non-existent. The question we're all asking is, how do we, as a society, as governments, as parents and as young people, make this reality a positive one for our collective future? And so our first speaker tonight is the Honourable Blair Boyer, the Member for Right and the Minister for Education, Training and Skills. Since 2018, Blair has been a South Australian Member of Parliament for the electorate of Right in our northeastern suburbs, the mighty northeast. In March 2022, he was appointed the Minister for Education, Training and Skills in the Malinowska State Government. Blair is particularly passionate about education and believes that a strong, affordable and accessible public education system is the key to equality. He believes that meaningful, dignified work is the bedrock of our society and should be available to all South Australians, regardless of their means or background. The Minister fights hard to improve education in South Australia in the interests of students, parents and teachers. And his upbringing from his father, who is also in the audience tonight, and his mother, in a rural environment has instilled in him a love of the country and an appreciation of the rewards that come from hard work and persistence. He's aware of the privilege that life has granted him and is determined to do his utmost to extend to all South Australians the opportunity to make the most of their talents and aspirations. And Blair's also a volunteer with the Salisbury SES unit and Modbury Meals on Wheels. As Blair comes to the stage, may I remind you all that we are filming tonight, and please have your phones on silent. Can we give the Minister a hand?
Thank you, Brad, for that very generous welcome. And could I also begin by acknowledging the land that we're meeting on this evening is Kaurna land and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. It's nice to hear my biography read out when my dad is here, as he is tonight. He doesn't come to me with all events. Tonight is a special occasion. But many of those words I crafted with Dad after being elected in 2018. I refer to my father in my speeches all too regularly, which is a bit of a running joke in my office, but he was a teacher himself for close to 40 years in the public education system in Victoria. I was fortunate enough to have him teach me on 3 occasions at the country high school that I attended. So I do have I feel extremely fortunate to have come to be in a position to be the Education Minister in South Australia myself, but I very much am still driven by the values that my father passed on to me in his many years in the classroom. And the topics that we're here talking about tonight are topics that my dad and I talk about quite regularly, and with my own daughters as we try to make sense of the digital world that we live in now, and remark on the changes since my dad started teaching in, I think, about 1972, when I started going to high school in about 1994, and now I have 3 daughters of my own who are in the public education system in the seat that I live. And I want to commend the Hawke Centre and Brad, our MC, for putting this evening's event on. It is really, really timely. Brad alluded to in his introductory remarks that these things have been in the media recently. In fact, these are issues that I've been dealing with over the last few months. They are issues that I've been dealing with today. My day started with an interview with ABC 891 talking about some issues that appeared in today's Adelaide Advertiser and on the news last night around some violent incidents which occurred at a school out in the northeast just on Monday, which were, although they took place not on the school site and not during school hours, they were students from the school in question and recorded each other fighting at a bus stop. And we've seen a number of these come to light. Of course, the fact that we do live in this age of incredible technology where everyone carries basically a high definition camera in their pocket means that I think more than ever before we are seeing very graphic representations of violent acts between kids. But of course, we are also seeing the effect that the internet and social media has in terms of actually driving some of these violent acts as well. I'm going to speak about that just briefly in a second. But I was sort of asked to focus on 3 issues facing education in regard to digital technology. And first of all, I think the most important thing is digital literacy. How do we teach digital literacy in our young people? And I think that challenge is twofold. It's, of course, about helping kids be thoughtful about the information that the internet is giving them, but it's also a real challenge in terms of teaching kids to be careful about the information that they are actually giving the internet as well. And I often remark, my own kids are too young to understand this kind of fatherly tale yet, but I do remark to young people who are involved or keen in politics, who are seeking to come up through the ranks now to find a pathway to potentially being maybe an elected member of a parliament somewhere, that I feel really fortunate as someone who is 41 and a member of parliament, and I reckon Brad will be with me on this one, that smartphones weren't around when I was at high school or at university or pretty much any time before I was 26. And I really do feel for young people, because we all do silly things when we're young. It happens. And the kind of wisdom I think that you need to understand that there are some things you should not be filming, recording or putting on social media for all people to see are things that could really affect your employability, electability, all those things when you are older. I don't think it's possible for 10, 12, 16, 18-year-old people to have the life experience and wisdom you need to know that something you have just put on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok is something that actually might stay as a part of your digital footprint for years to come, and something that might be looked upon unfavourably by your potential employer in years to come, or used by a political opponent against you in 20 years to come. So that, I think, goes to the heart of the issue around digital literacy, and not just teaching kids about how they interpret and decipher and make credible judgments about the information that they are extracting from the internet, but how they make really smart long-term decisions around what information they give to the internet, which is obviously a really big part of it as well. So the conversations that I've had with my father and my senior advisor, Gary Costello, who's sitting with Dad over there, who has had a long history in the education system as a teacher and principal, and we have often remarked about how the role of teachers and leaders in our schools has changed. I mean, I think about the things that we now think are the responsibility of schools compared to what was deemed by the sort of broader public as being the responsibility of schools 30 years ago, how drastically that has changed. And the event that I was talking about on radio this morning, I thought was a very good example of that, because a question that was put to me, because in this school in question, we have responded by putting security guards into the school, which is an extreme measure, but it is something that is working. Now, this fight, which was, violent and unacceptable, occurred off school grounds, and it occurred out of school hours, and it was put to me by one member of the media about whether or not, I think the question was basically, have the security guards that you've put in at the school failed to stop fights outside the school, essentially? And my first reaction to that was, well, things have certainly changed in terms of the public debate around what schools, teachers and principals are now responsible for, because what we are essentially saying is the behaviour of children at a particular school is now the responsibility of that school and the broader education system before the school bell goes in the morning and after the school bell goes in the afternoon. Now that is a really big shift. So in talking about, I guess, what our system is trying to do in terms of digital literacy, I'm always careful to say that we have put such an extra and added burden on classroom teachers and our education system in terms of what their role is in young people's lives compared to what it used to be. And we are at a juncture now where we have workforce shortages in lots of areas. We have them in education. Eastern states are at the point now where they are struggling to fill existing teacher vacancies. We are having people who are not choosing the profession when they're coming out of high school. We have people who are exiting the teaching system earlier in their careers than they would otherwise do so. And all the while, we are essentially piling more and more onto the plates of teachers and school leaders in terms of what they are responsible for. So I always make the point that I am cautious in saying that digital literacy, on top of everything else, is the sole responsibility of schools, because it's not, of course. It is also the responsibility of society more broadly and the responsibility of parents. But there are some key things that we're trying to do, and we do have digital literacy as part of the curriculum now, which is an important thing. But there is an election commitment that was made by this new South Australian state government before the March election around what has been referred to as a ban of mobile phones in high schools. So here in South Australia, the former state government in the last 4 years banned mobile phones in primary schools. That has been brought into effect. There was not a ban put in place for high schools. Now, we made a commitment in 2019 that if we were elected, we would change that. And we are in the consultation phase now, basically, of delivering the policy, which will go live across all our sites in the public education system in South Australia from the second semester of next year. It's a really big undertaking. It's a complicated thing to deliver. And some of the critics in the initial stages have said to me, and they've said to, the Chief Executive of the Education Department, that this is not the answer. We need to be teaching kids about how to use these things safely. And we are still doing that. But I think in other jurisdictions, both in Australia and overseas, where restrictions of the use of mobile phones and smart devices during school hours and during recess and lunch have been put in place, we are actually now beginning to see really solid, credible data coming out, which shows that it has actually made a difference. It has made a real difference. And alongside that, we can still do the work around teaching kids how to use those devices smartly. But I think there are enormous issues that are playing out in schools around, of course, kids attention being distracted by mobile phones and smart devices, but also how they are being used to fuel bullying and fights. Now, and a lot of these really graphic cases of physical violence that we've seen in schools recently, and I've unfortunately in my role had cause to watch them time and time again, we hear other students egging the perpetrators on in the background. And it becomes apparent, after watching a few times, that the only real reason those people are egging the perpetrators on to fight is because they actually want to just capture content for TikTok. Back in the day when I went to school, went to high school, were there fights? Yes, they were. Some of them, I remember, even were quite violent fights. But the kids who might have been around cheering on the assailant, they weren't holding a smartphone, they weren't going to record anything, and they weren't planning on encouraging the fight with the purpose of recording it and then republishing it time and time again, where it's seen by another 1,000, another 15,000 people. And the added trauma that compounds on the victim particularly is of real concern to me, because I have had occasion to speak to the parents of victims in some of these really serious schoolyard bullying incidents, who have spoken to me about the enormous sense of shame that their son or daughter feels about the fact that when they go to school the next day, or it might be a few weeks after the incident, they know that everyone they're looking at the school, all their classmates, colleagues, have all seen the footage of them being beaten up. And they know that thousands of people on the internet have seen it as well. Now, bullying has always been in our schools. Sadly, it will probably always be there. But I remember in my primary and high school years, usually at least there was some kind of reprieve when the school bell went at the end of the day. You could retreat home to the safety of your house and your parents' and family's support. But with these devices and social media being, just everywhere and having infiltrated all parts of our lives, those people who are being bullied have no respite from it anymore at all. They go home after a day of being bullied at school, and the same perpetrators of that bullying then use social media platforms to continue it. And we all know that this is contributing in a really significant way to the deteriorating mental health of our young people. So I'm conscious I was only supposed to speak for a few minutes earlier. I've probably already gone over my time. But I guess to summarise, the three real challenges are: how do we both manage to restrict access to mobile phones and smart devices where it's appropriate, but continue to teach the important digital literacy stuff? How do we assist our teachers and school leaders to ameliorate the behavioural impacts that smartphones and the internet and social media platforms are having on our school sites? And then how do we find the right balance, I think, for students in terms of how they are learning to use these things in all the parts of our lives that they are now important, whilst also maintaining the more old-fashioned kind of socialisation skills that we know they're going to need. That's the big challenge and complexity, I think, and I'm looking forward to having a chance to speak about it in more detail with our panellists. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Our next speaker is Carla Wilshire OAM, Chief Executive Officer of the Social Policy Group and Director for the Centre for Digital Wellbeing, and my boss. Carla is the founding CEO of the Social Policy Group, which is a national body with specialist expertise in social policy and program design, with a focus on population diversity, social and community cohesion, gender equality, community participation and inclusion, systems responsiveness, and community outreach and engagement. Carla has a background in public policy development and impact strategy, corporate governance, and tertiary research. Before establishing Social Policy Group, Carla worked in senior roles in the public service and as an advisor to the government, principally in migration and settlement, including as Chief of Staff to the Minister for Multicultural Affairs. She's also held academic and consulting positions in Australia and abroad. Carla is also the Deputy Chair of Football Australia and a Board Director of the Australian Centre for Social Innovation. She's the co-founder and deputy chair of the Migrant and Refugee Health Partnership and the Judicial Council on Cultural Diversity, a member of the Council of the Harmony Alliance, which is the National Migrant and Refugees Women's Alliance, and the director for the Centre for Digital Wellbeing. Thank you, Carla, and welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Brad. The trick to getting a really good introduction is to make sure one of your staff members does it for you. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Kaurna land and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the Minister and to really to point out how inspirational his words are. You're not allowed to pick between your children, I'm told. I can't pick a favourite. But as an advocate, and I get an opportunity to work across states and territories as well as at the national level, I think you might be my favourite minister. So, thank you very much. Your leadership on these issues in particular has been phenomenal. As Brad mentioned, I'm CEO of the Social Policy Group, and a couple of years ago, we really started looking at the way in which digital technology, but in particular, this device, has very much changed us and changed society. And look, I freely admit I love my mobile phone. It's my enduring companion, my portal to the world, curator of my news. It sets my diary. It is my means of social connection. Its dulcet beeps start my mornings, and it's probably the last thing I look at the end of the day. And it's changed me. And it's not just changed me, it's changed us all. We are now hybrid creatures. We exist both in the real world, but we also exist in the online world. The way in which it's changed us is so profound. Our time is a commodity. And access to us is sold to the highest bidder, pretty much minute by minute. And counted in nanoseconds, the war for our attention pretty much rages on. So, to some extent, we relinquish our free will to an algorithm, knowing that it will offer us all sorts of conveniences, but it'll also take away certain aspects of our privacy. The average American adult checks their phones 352 times per day, which, when you account for sleep time, is an average of, I think, once every 2 minutes, if my maths is correct. There's some teachers in the audience, so hopefully one of them can steer me on that. The average American 12-year-old spends, not in talk time, but just in screen time, 7 hours and 22 minutes staring at their mobile phone. And that's just phone time, so that doesn't account for consoles or computer time or other forms of screen time. It's pretty much the most significant thing or activity, apart from sleep, that most children will do once they have one. And this changes our relationship to technology. And to make this point, it really is a generational change. The generation that we are raising now is very much a hybrid generation. And I wanted to kind of talk us through three different things. And the first thing I want to talk us through is the fact that it starts really early. So in the 0 to 5 category, what we know is that already prior to children going to school in the first and early years, children's relationships to phones are really important in terms of setting their behavioural and behaviours and their capacity for self-regulation. So 2 ways in which phones affect children in the first 5 years. One is that one of the things that parents have gotten quite used to doing, and I'm 100% guilty of this, is that every time your child gets distressed or upset or tantrums, you hand them an episode of Bluey on their mobile phone. And the term for that is digital pacification. And what it does is it interrupts, for small children, that process of learning emotional self-regulation. So if you think of the arc of emotional regulation going from no regulation to co-regulation to self-regulation, in some senses inserting that technology really early just disrupts the capacity to be able to learn those skill sets. And then I think the second way is that even from a parenting perspective, I was a working mum. I held down the position I have as CEO while I was also breastfeeding and raising babies. And all of the time I was doing this and staring blankly at my mobile phone. And so the other way in which we know this really disrupts the early years is that it disrupts attachment and that capacity for a child to look at its parents in the face and to be able to mimic facial expressions and to connect. We know that as a result of that, we are seeing an increase in behavioural issues. So the more time that young kids have spent time on mobile phones during periods of emotional distress, we see an elevation in terms of behavioural issues, and that then feeds into the school system. And I think one of the things it does is apply a lot of pressure onto teachers. So that's number one issue that I wanted to talk about. Number two issue that I wanted to talk about was the fact that we have, in some senses, a generation that is also experiencing what I'm going to describe as a digital bifurcation. So, and very much based on gender grounds. The ways in which young girls engage with technology is really different to the way in which young boys engage with technology. And I'll break that down a little bit. Young girls, even in terms of social media platforms, they pick different platforms. So not uniformly, but statistically. Young girls tend to pick TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat. Young boys tend to pick YouTube, Twitch, and Reddit. I had to go and look up what Twitch was, by the way. And in some senses, young girls are picking the types of platforms that really respond to visual validation. So I'm going to put my photo out there and then I'm going to see how many likes I get. And what we're seeing is that that's really increasing issues such as body dysmorphia and in some senses, we're seeing an elevation in anxiety for teenage girls. For young boys, it tends to be information-based platforms, and so they're having a very different digital experience, but it's also an experience that probably opens them up far more towards disinformation and towards the sorts of harms that can come from conspiracy theories and from online content that is quite harmful in itself. Secondly, young boys have a strong preference towards gaming versus young girls. So just to give you stats, young boys will spend on average 2 hours and 17 minutes per day playing a game in the US. Okay, we've got stats for the US. For young girls, it's 47 minutes. And they'll pick different games, which is also really interesting. So young girls will pick games that are like match 3 or farm simulations. They're completion-based games, so their main motivation is to complete it. For young boys, it's tactical shooter games and multiplayer fantasy games. So you've got a really different digital experience. But we have to remember this is the hybrid generation. They're socialising online, so they're having a totally different experience of socialisation. And that sort of brings me into my third point, which is if they are socialising online, and we know how important now gaming is as a form of socialisation outside of school. Does anyone have kids that play Fortnite? Yep, okay, great. The amount of time that's within the context of a world or a game that is created and a world that's created really kind of impacts that process of socialisation. And one of the other issues that we really look at around gender is the fact that to some extent those games are created by men for boys. Predominantly. So if you look at the gaming industry, it's 88.2% of the creators of games are men. And so some of the gender assumptions that are built in and baked into those games really form the context of socialisation and the world in which young boys are socialising. And I think that really has a significant impact in terms of the way in which we are experiencing the first beginnings of an awareness around gender equity and gender power dynamics. And on that point, to bring it home, if you look at the stats and the evidence, and this is where I start to get really concerned, the generation that's coming, Generation Z, might well be the first generation to go backwards on gender equality. And I'll just let that sink in. So survey that was done of 2,076 participants in the UK that was 16 to 24, so Gen Z. And for the first time, they had a larger group than previous generations. So 50% of the boys felt that feminism had gone too far and makes it harder for young men to succeed. And those sorts of sentiments are very much echoed in the sorts of survey results that we're starting to see within an Australian context as well, and particularly around attitudes towards violence against women, attitudes towards economic participation, attitudes towards power dynamics in relationships. And so to some extent, as much as we see ourselves as progressing on issues such as gender equality, we're not looking at that digital space. We're only really looking at one part of that story. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. The first generation to go backwards on gender equality does sound really scary. We need to work together on this. And our final speaker for this evening is writer, author, theatre maker, Twitter superstar Van Badham. Van is an internationally award-winning writer and theatre maker. As a journalist, she's written for the New York Times, Bloomberg, The Telegraph and The Age, and she maintains a regular column for The Guardian. Widely published as an essayist and poet, she's appeared in anthologies for Hardy Grant, Black Ink, MUP and QUP, and wrote the novel Burnt Snow for Pan Macmillan. Her plays include Banging Denmark for STC, The Bloody Chamber for Malthouse, and The Bull, the Moon and the Coronet of Stars for Griffin Theatre. Her newest non-fiction book is 2021's History of Internet Conspiracy Cults, QAnon and On, which you can purchase on your way out and have signed by Van for Hardy Grant. Van appears regularly on television and radio as a commentator, critic and activist, and right now is developing new projects here in SA with the State Theatre Company, which is very exciting. Thank you, Van, for being with us and flying in today. Come up.
Thanks, Brad. I'd like to acknowledge I'm the land of the Kaurna people, and if I'm a little tired, it's because this morning I woke up on the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people in Brisbane. I am currently living on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, caring for my mother in Sydney. But traditionally, I live on the land of the Wathaurong people of the Kulin Nation in the beautiful Central Highlands of Victoria. I mention this because Australia has always been a multicultural place, and we are mature enough as a society to be several different places at once. I'd like to acknowledge all First Nations people in the room, especially because I've been doing so much travelling recently. I think we live in the most beautiful country on earth, and we live in a beautiful country because of tens of thousands of years of considerate environmental custodianship by First Nations people. I've written a book, which you can buy, which goes into some detail about what I'm now going to talk about. So it is very difficult to condense what I have been studying for the past couple of years. I went undercover in a conspiracy cult. I went undercover in QAnon. QAnon is a modern and ancient phenomenon simultaneously. It's based on an idea that Donald Trump is a hero out in his white hat rescuing children who Hillary Clinton, who is an alien lizard person from outer space, has been kidnapping to torture and drink the blood of, most notoriously, apparently in basements under pizza restaurants run by gay men in Washington, DC. QAnon first came to my attention in around late 2017, 2018, which was quite early, when I started receiving a new flavour of abuse. I am, of course, a woman on the internet. In case you hadn't been told, I'm the ugliest, grossest, fattest, stupidest person on earth. Just search Twitter. I'm sure people will supply you with this information quite readily. But I got a new flavour of abuse. It was quite apocalyptic and evangelistic in tone, and thought, I better file this because these guys look like they could murder someone. As it turns out, QAnon adherents, people who organise the internet to listen to the great mythology of evil lizard person from outer space, Hillary Clinton, and brave Donald Trump, who's rescuing children from her clutches as we speak. I started following American journalism and found that I wasn't the only journalist being targeted by QAnon believers who were mounting something of an aggressive campaign to identify people who critiqued the narrative of Donald Trump's brilliance and who contradicted their worldview of alien lizard people and their nefarious activities. And what has happened is that in the years since 2017, when the QAnon mythos first appeared online, QAnon believers have been arrested. A couple of them participated, well, more than a couple, hundreds of them participated in the riots in the Capitol building, trying to overthrow a democratic election in the United States. Two of the people who died that day were QAnon believers, literally losing their life for an internet conspiracy theory. There have been terrorism incidents, man occupied a bridge with explosives. There have been people wielding knives. There have been attempts on the lives of various politicians. Undercover in the cult, I had the rare privilege of watching about 200 people threaten the life of Northern Territory Chief Minister Michael Gunner in about an hour. And when he was trying to impose very basic protections of vaccine protection in the Northern Territory. And infamously, unfortunately, when I was actually doing the last few paragraphs of the book, a man in the United States convinced his partner and mother of his children was secretly a lizard person, took his 2 toddler-aged children to Mexico and murdered them so they would not grow into lizard people monsters. It's what we're dealing with. The thing that you learn when you study QAnon and this unbelievable community of people who are willing to believe it is how conviction in belief systems comes from self-will. That people, when they're in distress, when they are fearing a loss of face, say they've lost custody of their children in a particular acrimonious relationship breakup, or they have gone through a divorce or lost their business or had an adverse court finding. These people are very happy to restore their sense of status by going to fake news sources on the internet, conspiracy cult groups, secret Facebook pages, and being told what they want to hear, that their problems are not their own, their problems are being caused by the evil minions of the great Antichrist Hillary Clinton and the journalists like myself who support her. Now let's extrapolate the reality of this community of willful political believers who are looking for easy answers to their own complex problems by attaching themselves to radical ideologies, and look at the spaces that bad faith political actors are weaponising and mobilising and how that involves young people. Because young people aren't occurring separately to that kind of political radicalisation online. In the research I did for QAnon and On, I looked at an extraordinary website called 4chan, which was founded as a free speech wonderland. No rules, no identities. You can post whatever you like on 4chan, and people do because it's entirely anonymous, including things like photographing their bowel movements, infamously murdering their girlfriends live to video, sharing pretty niche Japanese porn, and engaging in involving tentacles, not actually joking, and engaging in bullying, coordinated bullying, harassment on the level of tens of thousands of people, identifying targets, notoriously people from minority communities and women, specifically feminists. I had the great honour of having my internet account, my Twitter account hacked by 4chan activists in 2016 and finding that porn abusing women had been sent from my Twitter account and also racially abusive messages sent from my account targeting my friends. 4chan as a free speech wonderland, and this behaviour kind of tends to indicate a fairly immature worldview. And this might be because 4chan was actually designed by a 15-year-old boy. Nobody knew he was 15 at the time, but using a translation engine and some open source code available on the internet, he built the website over a period of several months and was operating the kind of radical publishing project that frankly would scare the bejesus out of an adult. Now, the problem with these absolute free speech wonderlands on the internet and what we have learned in the radical consequences of them is that a place that allows anything to be said might originally attract ironic comment and in-jokes, and infamously 4chan participants used a lot of the kind of misogynistic, racist and anti-Semitic language that had developed in the culture of multiplayer online gaming. It doesn't take long for people who genuinely hold those views to turn up. And the collective that was formed, the community formed on 4chan around that shared language, enabled the re-entry into public discourse of the neo-fascists, neo-Nazis, absolute radical misogynists that we are seeing influence global politics worldwide. And of course, when those communities form with those kind of influences, there are a lot of bad faith political actors who like to join them. I'll give you an example of this monster power of the internet. Was some years ago, the kids, the boys, were playing a game called World of Warcraft. You know, you go in and you get axes and you form battle parties and you chop up hordes of orcs. And what had started happening was that Western kids who didn't have a lot of time to play the game were paying kids in Asian countries who were better at the game than they were, paying them money, cash transactions, to play the game for them while they were at school so they would advance up certain levels and get better weapons. Now, a company formed to run like a currency exchange of credits to sort of formalise these arrangements so Western kids could buy X number of credits in order to play this game. And an investment banker with an association from Goldman Sachs invested a considerable amount of money in this particular form of currency exchange. The internet, communities based around 4chan and niche sort of online gaming circles dominated by young men, went to war and absolutely destroyed what was an enterprise of which this banker had invested more than $100 million in venture capital. It taught that particular investor a lesson about, as I said, the monster power of rootless young males and their capacity to organise on the internet, to mobilise, to cause disruption. The banker's name was Steve Bannon. And as he was putting together the campaign that would eventually recruit Donald Trump to become, and I'm not going to mince words, a neo-fascist figurehead of a radicalised right-wing Republican Party, Steve Bannon entered the spaces that he knew were full of those rootless white males and with a steady stream of targeted propaganda mobilised them into the force that helped get Trump into office as unpaid online propagandists. He's not the only bad faith actor in this space. When QAnon first appeared in 4chan in 2017, this wild rumour about how Donald Trump was going to have Hillary Clinton arrested at any point and taken off to Guantanamo Bay to face punishment for her crimes, within 4 days, 4,000 Russian government-backed accounts were sharing these stories on Twitter, on Reddit, on Facebook, and getting into the corners of the internet that most governments aren't even aware exist. We are at a very dangerous time where particularly young people are targeted around their perfectly normal, youthful insecurities and anxieties and weaponised and mobilised by adults with extremely evil, anti-democratic political agendas to support the kind of hateful radicalisation that once upon a time in Western history resulted in the Holocaust and the Second World War. I'm not underselling this at all. Who has read my book here? Terrifying, isn't it? Absolutely terrifying. Because this is sophisticated strategic engagement, manipulating vulnerable communities of young people, particularly young men, and particularly preying on their anxieties around their attractiveness and their sexual performance. Misogyny, organised, targeted, recruited, stoked, is a radicalisation tool for the far right. Because if you can encourage a young man to dehumanise a woman, it's not a very long journey to dehumanise a black person, a person in a wheelchair, or a Jewish person. And this is the reality that the internet is facilitating. I don't want to freak anyone out, but if we're looking at problems on the internet, toxic masculinity, organised misogyny, targeted racism and virulent anti-Semitism, represented this week by no less than Kanye West, are the problems that we're facing. And the challenge before us is, are we committed enough to our democracy to actually defend it from organised neo-fascists? Thanks.
Thank you, Van. Can Minister and Carla come and join us on the stage? Well, there is lots to unpack in all of that, from lizard people to what is the role of education in helping young people understand that lizard people aren't real. So thank you to the three of you for your fantastic contributions. I'm just going to go straight into the questions because we've got half an hour left and I think there's a lot to talk about. So I'm going to kick to you first, Minister. One of the assumptions on this topic is that phones are a problem for kids from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. You know, that kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds don't have access to the same technology, all of that kind of thing. But how is this whole issue impacting on kids that are already living in vulnerable economic and social circumstances?
That's a very good question, and I think that assumption is incorrect. My observations as a Member of Parliament in areas in the northeast and north which have some disproportionately low-income families is that technology and mobile phones are such an important part of our lives now, and they're certainly an incredibly important status symbol as well to young people about what phone you have and what data plan you have, that most kids have access to one, even those who might be from a lower socioeconomic area. In fact, something that I've noticed is talking to young people in my area, particularly who might have part-time jobs, often fairly lowly paid part-time jobs that might be in hospitality and retail, that they are scrimping and saving to buy a mobile phone. We're talking about, you know, a top-of-the-line iPhone, Apple iPhone, which might cost close to $2,000, and that they are doing their shifts at McDonald's or wherever it might be to save enough because that thing they want the most and feel they need is a mobile phone. So I think that assumption that issues around access to mobile phones and smartphones is really just something that more affluent families have to deal with is not true. And I think, like most of these things, that the downsides of having access to that technology, which we've all just spoken about in pretty painful detail, actually disproportionately affect those families from lower socioeconomic backgrounds more than the more affluent families, because, you know, money buys you means to try to fix things. Let's be honest about it. It buys you access to getting support for your children or having other options that those families who might be really struggling to deal with the effects of access to the internet and social media might be having on their kids, if they don't have the finances or the income to be able to deal with it, they're feeling the negative effects more than anybody else. I think we need to keep that in mind and certainly move away from this idea that is an issue that is just faced by those families which have the money to own smart devices.
Van or Carla, going to jump in on that?
There's no question. I think, in my experience, and there's a really good book that I certainly recommend everybody who's here who's interested in this topic read, called Stolen Focus by Johann Hari, which is about the effect that mobile phones are having on concentration spans and cognition. And it's creating developmental problems as well as social ones. I think it's responsible policy to look at mobile phone bans and get them out, because I think it also, you know, the idea that you're a young teenager and you are already trapped in I must earn in order to afford this thing, or I cannot socially function, that deprives young people of a lot of freedom and agency and the opportunity to experiment and to develop values that are beyond just material consumption. And the internet really feeds that, because it doesn't stop with the mobile phone. Like, even games, like online games these kids play, like match 3 games, they have in-app purchases, and shopping is absolutely targeted. And so the kid is not just pursuing the phone. They're pursuing the items that are sold on the phone. There are no regulations around that. Like, no one's going to stop people advertising to your children if they have that phone and that device. Yeah. And that raises huge issues about raising a, completely materialistic, manipulated, sold to, like, turning children into nothing but market consumers when they're how old? Like 14? Is that it? Is that all we're going to allow to happen in society? And of course, the same techniques of advertising are used by the propagandists and the bad faith political actors. I mean, it is staggering. So just to give you another little insight, in my undercover work with QAnon, I watched them go from being obsessed about Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton to very quickly being anti-vaxxers and obsessed with stopping anti-vaccination and threatening to kill Michael Gunner and Daniel Andrews. And, I mean, they were really very, very heavy on the planning around the murder of Michael Gunner and his 2-year-old child. And then almost overnight, I watched the same accounts flip and become pro-Russian government accounts telling me that Volodymyr Zelensky, the democratically elected Jewish president of Ukraine, was a Nazi who was going to wage war. And, I mean, the propaganda relationships are so tight, and they're set up using the same forms of communication, the same provocations, the same manipulative techniques. And unless we're in a situation where we have the social robustness to educate and demobilise and regulate and diffuse that kind of manipulation, we are in real trouble.
Carla?
Yeah, so I think also just taking it back to mobile phone bans in schools, I think, one of the things we've got to recognise in the evidence base is that mobile phone bans actually disproportionately benefit kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So you see about a 14% or a double the whammy in terms of the effect of a mobile phone ban for lower socioeconomic kids than for kids from higher socioeconomic areas. And also kids who aren't necessarily performing as well, you see a significantly greater increase in terms of performance. So I think the evidence base certainly around lower socioeconomic areas and mobile phones would very much point to the fact that this is probably a policy that's also a policy about equality. And I think Van's point particularly around the fact that you're talking about an entire economic ecosystem is a very salient one, because to some extent, even the way in which it is training young people, particularly around investment versus consumption, is a huge part of the picture. And I think if you're from a high socioeconomic family and you have all sorts of other contexts of training around how you engage in terms of e-commerce and digital commerce, you're at a natural advantage. But if you're not, then to some extent, one of the things it is training young people around is to buy products online and to have instant gratification. And that really is going to impact their investment strategies long term, their capacity to be able to save, their capacity to be able to accumulate wealth.
So related to this mobile phone conversation was one of the questions from someone here in the audience. School students are expected to use electronic devices in the classroom for learning, like laptops or iPads, either supplied by the school or by their parents. Yet they're not allowed to use mobile phones in class, and there's a proposal to ban them entirely from schools. How do you resolve that conundrum? The digital environment is on every device, it's not just the mobile phone, and there seems a contradiction there.
It's a very fair question, and we've sort of deep in a lot of consultation on this at the moment with groups that represent secondary principals in South Australia particularly, because it's their members who will be in charge of trying to roll this out at their sites. And we know that smart technology, whether it's a laptop or a smartwatch or a phone, they're everywhere. It's not as simple in terms of disconnecting kids from those social media platforms to just take their phone away. But we will have in place exemptions where they are appropriate, where laptops need to be used as part of the curriculum, that's fine. But all the feedback that we have had from classroom teachers and principals is that smartphones themselves aren't really being used for that purpose in classes. Laptops, sure, that they're being used as part of the curriculum. They have an important place in the classroom. Smartwatches and mobile phones don't. They are being used to communicate on TikTok or Instagram or Snapchat. They're being used to message friends, all those kind of things, which actually aren't an important part of the curriculum. So I think it's actually an overly kind of convenient argument for those who may not be as supportive of a restriction or a ban to try to conflate it all together and say that the phones themselves are an important part of the classroom now, because that's not actually the truth of it. But you know, I think it's too important for us now just to throw our hands up in the air and say it's too hard to enforce, there's nothing we can do, because we're seeing, you know, in graphic detail what the effects are on our young people, and it must be within our means in this day and age for us to enforce something which can find a balance. That's our job as leaders.
Yeah, and I think the Minister makes a really important point as well, that the actual type of technology you're using really does inform how you use it as well. You know, there is a reason why Facebook took off and took off astronomically almost immediately after the iPhone was out and around. And it was once Facebook adapted to mobile first that it really started to escalate. And that is that you use technologies in different ways. You use a computer, the way in which you will engage with a computer and the type of social engagement you will have, let alone just broader work engagement, will be really different to the way in which you'll use a mobile phone.
Look, and there's an opportunity for us to look at the interface between the technology and the child, and that is in app development and actually investing some money in what we want the forms of engagement to be. We have some of the best game studios in the world in Australia, thanks to investments made in games development and design by Simon Crane, like in the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government. And that has created like a generation of makers who are a national resource that can be invested in to build infrastructure that inculcates the kind of values that we want kids to have. Because this is another thing, I learned the other day about TikTok, which is very popular with young people, which is the little short, for those of you who don't know what TikTok is, you make a little video of yourself. It's an app that has some film devices that are automated and you can make little videos. And then the videos that you make are shared. Well, in China, where that app was developed, the algorithm popularises videos sent out to Chinese children that have kids earning their martial arts qualifications, or kids celebrating doing really well in their exams, or graduating, or these sort of acts of social achievement. In the West, the algorithms prioritise kids doing stupid things and dancing and vandalising stuff and just doing sort of trivial acts. And it's all geo-targeted. There is absolutely no reason why Australian governments can't take a leadership role in commissioning and developing interfaces that reward the values we want to encourage people. We're encouraging young people, like just as we see the importance of a school curriculum and the importance of infrastructure in teaching us how to be Australian, how we behave, everything from our public transport to urban design decisions, teach us how to function socially in a certain way, we can actually do that with the infrastructure of the internet, and we have the capacity to do that as well.
So the Minister raised the interesting question of what is the job of education these days? Is it to send security guards over the road to the bus stop or is it to take responsibility for the way young people act once they leave the school grounds? And then we're also talking now about government regulation and how that can impact on the way young people and all of us engage digitally. So putting those two ideas together, what are some good things that are happening in Australia or around the world? Where are the potential solutions, both in education and in regulation?
That's the big question, isn't it? And if I could go back to the comment I made in my introductory remarks about how the things that we task our schools with being responsible for has changed over the years to now include digital literacy and enforcing the safe use of smart devices. I think as hard as that is on our teachers and our school leaders, the world has changed, and we have to find a way of being able to support our schools and support our classroom teachers to actually play a role in that. And there are some really, really good things, of course, happening as well with the use of technology in our schools. But one of the things, Brad, that I've really observed as I've made my way around the first 7 months of being a minister and spoken to classroom teachers, and I've taken the opportunity to raise our commitment around a mobile phone ban in high schools, because I've been keen to get their input into how it might work and whether or not they think it's a worthwhile thing to do, because I'm conscious that where the rubber meets the road here is the start of every school day. We're going to be asking someone in school to take the phone away from a kid. And we know from some of the very good stats or scary stats that Carla said before, with people looking at their phone as many as 420 times a day, that there are going to be people and kids very unhappy to have their device taken away. And what we are actually potentially creating there at the start of the day, the very start of the school day, is a point of confrontation between a teacher and a pupil when the phone is taken away. So how do we actually manage that? Despite that, classroom teachers have spoken to me on a number of occasions about the fact that we also need to give our young people the space to form social bonds, relationships, and their own networks with people in their immediate environment, instead of relying on purely digital or social media relationships and interactions. We need young people to give them the opportunity away from those devices to meet their peers and their classmates and form a friendship. Because when things get tough for these kids, which they do in everyone's life at some point, and they look to whatever support network they may or may not have, it's tough when the only one you've got is a digital one, and it's people you've met through social media, or people you interact with social media, and you haven't had the chance to build those more old-fashioned relationships. So what's been pleasing to me is that even though classroom teachers and principals know that bringing in a restriction and a ban on mobile phones will make the job harder for them, particularly at the start of the day when they take the device away from a young person who hates being separated from it, they see that there is real value in giving our young people a bit of space away from them to develop the kind of relationships that hopefully all of the people in this room were able to develop in their secondary school years, and many of those friendships last years beyond that. So,
Carla, do you know things that are happening specifically in schools around the world that you could share with us?
Yeah, so look, I think there's probably a few points, and I think one of the things that the Minister raised previously, and really want to go back and touch on it, is even kids' understanding around data privacy. So we know that by the age of 13, I think the average child will have something like 62 million points of data available on them publicly out there in the world. Which is a staggering amount when you think about it. It's almost a generation that's being raised without privacy. And to some extent, some of the consequences of that in terms of a lifelong journey around employment, but other relationships, are really consequential. And so I think, I am very cautious in acknowledging that we put so much on teachers and that they're being asked to do more and more around, just general life skills, emotional behavioural regulation, solving really all problems of the world within the context of, 9 to 3 p.m. And without really and to some extent, without necessarily the resources to be able to do that. So I'm extremely sympathetic to that. But I think we're also raising the first hybrid generation. And so unless we're doing things to prepare young people for a relationship to technology, but more importantly, a relationship to each other through technology as part of the curriculum, we're also setting them up to fail. So unless we're talking about ethical online behaviours as embedded within all aspects of the curriculum, data privacy and critical media skills, I really recommend reading Van's book. It was absolutely terrifying, I'm not going to lie. And at times I had to reach for a tub of ice cream in comfort. But nonetheless, the information ecosystem that our children are going to be growing up within, we need to be able to prepare them to be able to manage that.
Funnily enough, the countries that do the best counter-disinformation work are all the Western democratic ones that share borders with Russia. Finland, Estonia and Ukraine, hilariously, are the ones who seem to have the most sophisticated tools when it comes to countering disinformation and political manipulation online. What a coincidence. Finland was quite ahead of this because I love talking about that. I love talking about Finland, literally my favourite place on earth. Finland, as part of its Cold War settlement to guarantee its border with what was then the Soviet Union, so the Soviets wouldn't invade it again, agreed to accept Soviet broadcasting, that there would be no limits on Soviet broadcasting in Finland, even though Finland was allowed to be a democratic country and have its own government. And the idea of the Soviet regime was that they'd inculcate the Finns with pro-Soviet values. So the Finns developed really robust counter-disinformation strategies back in the 1950s to sort of vaccinate the population against that kind of propagandistic influence. And the things that the Finns realised were really important was really strong and robust social institutions, that, you know, transparency and accountability in government is really important, because if you have a transparent and accountable democratic government, you are less susceptible to the persuasion that democracy is a bunk. Right. For example. Finns have great traditions in encouraging participation in shared civic infrastructure. So theatres and community parks and public broadcasting and libraries and accessible educational institutions are really important to developing a sense of social confidence in the society that you already live in, and learning through entertainment social behaviour that affirms your identity as a democratic citizen of a place that you actually like living in. The other thing that has been brought into the Finnish curriculum and in Estonia and in Ukraine was sophisticated counter-disinformation strategies that recognised that actually the good news, everybody wants some good news, the good news is that young people, the more understanding they have of media processes, the less likely they are to believe fake news and digital propaganda. So if kids know how the sausage is made, they can make a decision whether they want to eat the sausage or not. And that's actually a really important part of media literacy, because the kid who knows about Instagram filters and lighting and selective editing and photo manipulation tools is a kid who is less likely to be persuaded that everybody is beautiful except them. And learning those kind of, that understanding of how media is made is really empowering and gives kids a sense of ownership and control over their own narratives about themselves. Interestingly, older people are far more susceptible to fake news than younger people, because they're not digital natives and don't have, I'm sorry to break it to everybody, but the older you get, the more trusting you are of peer-supported information on the internet. Your friend Bob or my mum or whoever's opining online is likely to have more influence over you than a masthead, and your biases are more likely to be affirmed. So there is a capacity that we have that we need to really embrace to affirm our institutions. Really, like, one of the best things that's happening in terms of this issue is a federal ICAC is a really important intersectional policy victory for Australia, because policing democratic participation on behalf of the people and putting checks on, you know, like exploitation and scandal and duplicitous behaviour politically actually affirms robust values of social connectedness. But also refunding the ABC is very important, supporting public libraries and fighting for greater access to quality and well-funded public education. And I just want to acknowledge how absolutely fantastic it is to have a state education minister who went to state school, because I went to state school. And Blair, between you and Jason Clare, this is the most represented I've felt in years.
So to play devil's advocate just for a minute, and then to try and finish off on some advice for parents and families, we were told the printing press would destroy society, then television, then computers and computer games, and now, the internet and the digital world is going to destroy society. Is this just wowserism, or is it something that we can give tools to parents, teachers, grandparents, and ourselves to address? And what are some of those tools? So there's two bits to that question. Is it wowserism, and what can we do about it?
Arguably, all of those things did destroy society. They certainly destroyed the societies that came before.
Yeah.
Printing press, rather important in democracy, and also rather a lot of religious wars. So, some good, some bad. I think the point is, very wise gentleman who was interested in revolutionary change once suggested that in order to get revolutionary change, you had to seize the means of production. We are going through a period of revolutionary change because what we understand to be media and our dominant form of social instruction is coming through mobile phones, where anyone can seize the means of production. Turns out, a bit idealistic to think that was not going to be problematic in a world that has, let's underline this, Nazis still in it. But that means, like I said, looking at what are the other sources of cultural information and how can we support them in an intersectional way. And I do want to acknowledge there are some of my colleagues from the State Theatre Company of South Australia here, and institutions like theatres that bring people together have a really important social role in affirming and educating on values of social participation and behaviour. They raise education levels, theatres, wherever they're built, because they become a place where ideas can be discussed and mediated quite safely, because the king is not actually being murdered on the stage. The woman who is in trouble will get up and take her makeup off at the end of the show, and that we know that it's a fictive environment and we can make emotional decisions in quite a safe space about what those lessons mean to us. Cultural infrastructure, if we just leave it to mobile phones, we will lose. But if we look at the places where we congregate, participate, educate one another, instruct one another, and be entertained, that's how we affirm the democratic values that make us strong.
Yeah. Carla, what can parents do in that mix?
What can parents do in that mix? So I think Van makes a really important point, which is that every time we have had a new technology, whether that's the Industrial Revolution, even going back to agriculture, we've had a period where it's actually probably led to a deterioration in quality of life. And to some extent, I think one of the challenges we've got with digital technology is it's been so rapid and so prolific and so fast that we really haven't had the opportunity for social policy to keep a pace to that. And I think the difficulty is that parents feel very isolated in that. There isn't a lot of guidance. Most parents I know don't even have an indicative idea of when they should give their child a mobile phone. When are they ready? What sort of safeguards should they put in place? What conversations should they have? I know parents who have now bought safes for their houses so they can lock the mobile phones away. And it has turned households into a battleground. And so for a lot of parents, I think, are crying out for a degree of a bit more of a steer around what are some of those solutions and how can they collectively work together. But I also really agree with Van's point that some of the solutions are in community, and they're in rebuilding, and particularly post-COVID, a sense of community. And a lot of that is face-to-face community, but it's also about places to have conversations and to be able to really outline those sorts of issues and ideas.
So, Carla, before we go on, is there an age you should give our kids a phone?
So, the evidence suggests it's between 14 and 16, and that before that, there are a whole lot of risks involved. And even then, it should be 14 to 16 with a lot of conversations and some preparatory lead-up and some training wheels.
I can't put it any better than Van and Carla just have. That was very eloquently put, I guess, about the challenges that we're facing. And I know from, as a parent of 3 young kids of my own, how parents feel helpless and sort of alone in the challenge of managing their own kids' access to mobile phones and the internet. I think the way Van put it was bang on when we spoke about the printing press and radio and television, and then they were all going to be the end of society, and they weren't, but they did change society in fundamental ways, as the internet has done and smart devices have. I think for me, and I'm speaking here more as a parent than as the Minister for Education, the difference with the internet, social media and smart devices compared to, say, television, the printing press and radio is the means that parents or carers or grandparents have to control their kids' access to those is more limited, because the nature of the infiltration of those devices in our lives is so complete. It is very hard. You know, I remember, it's good that I've got Dad here tonight because I can talk about growing up on the farm and only being allowed to watch ABC, which was 50% of the channels that we got anyway. It was either that or something else. My parents actually took the TV out of the household between my primary school years of grade 3 and 5, I think, which was absolutely mortifying at the time. I could tell you, have to tell people at school that we didn't have a TV and we went down to my grandparents who lived on the farm to watch TV. But looking back on that, it was great because I started reading more and developed that habit for life. But it's not as simple now for us just to pull those devices out of our kids' hands, remove all the smart things that are all the Internet of Things that are connected in the household, and from school you can't do it. So I think the difference in terms of the challenge that we're facing now as a society compared to the challenge particularly that parents faced when those other inventions came along is the means of controlling it is just so much more complex. And I guess I'd refer to what Carla said about the things that we can do, the role parents have in terms of being good role models. And I know that often I am not for my own kids because of my job, but about exhibiting, positive, being a positive role model in terms of your own use of your mobile phone and the internet is important. But clearly there is a role for schools to play here too, where we teach to use it safely. But I think increasingly we are going to see other jurisdictions and places around the world move to a model of actually restricting access to the physical devices themselves for a period of time at schools. I think what we are seeing now is credible and legitimate data that suggests that there is value in that. And I know it sounds draconian, I know it sounds like blunt policy, and it is, but you know, what Van says is we take action now, or we reap what we sow in years to come, and it will not be good. So that's what we're going to do.
Fantastic, thank you. We are out of time, so I'd like to really thank Minister Blair Boyer for your leadership on this in our education system here in South Australia, and for Van for your relentless voice on this in our public discourse, and Carla for creating the Centre for Digital Wellbeing and really pioneering some of this work in Australia. Would you please thank our panellists for being with us tonight?